Good evening and welcome to the Adam Smith Institute. My name is Matthew Kilcoyne and I'm the Deputy Director here. In a couple of weeks' time, and it may have escaped your notice because they're actually have flown under the radar for many parts of the United Kingdom, although they loom large in other parts of the United Kingdom, some quite important elections happening. And maybe some less important ones. We're calling these the midterms, the culmination of 143 English councils with approximately 5,000 seats up for grabs, 39 police and crime commissioners, 129 Scottish Parliament MSPs, 60 Welsh Senedd MSs now, members of the Senedd, they used to be called Assembly members, 25 Assembly members of the London GLA, and 13 directly elected mayors to discuss everything that's going to be happening, whether we should care at all, and what it is the British state should be looking at, and maybe thinking about it as a unitary state, or maybe it should be thinking of it as a fragmented union of nations. We'll be joined by Poppy Bullard, who's a producer with Matt Chorley on Times Radio and previously produced Question Time, taking her right across the UK and understanding local and national issues at play each week. Stephen Daisley, who's a Spectator regular and a columnist for the Scottish Daily Mail, with a particularly keen insight on the increasing growth of nationalist politics in Scotland, and Calgie, who is a reporter at Guido Fawkes, the UK's most read and respected political blog. I'm going to kick off with Poppy Bullard. Tell us, Poppy, is there anything in the sort of the melange of elections happening that provides a coherent narrative? And how do people covering these elections try to cover it in a way that's both national and hyper-local?
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. But I think if we're going to talk about things that are, if you want to kind of project the macro onto the micro, the place to be looking in May is Hartlepool. And I mean, I think this is essentially a gift to Westminster watchers. You know, every single person, both on this call, and I'm sure a lot of you watching this evening, are basically have been looking for a kind of a Westminster measuring stick after a year of Keir Starmer and a year of pandemic in the most talked about region of British politics that we've had in years. So I think for me, certainly, I am both keen to see what the outcome is, but also kind of keen to look at the broader picture, because actually I don't know that this seat is going to be, you know, the red wall bellwether that everybody talks about. I mean, I think, you know, I'm sure we'll get into this later, but essentially, in short, this is going to be the place that people are looking to extrapolate thoughts on Keir Starmer, thoughts on Boris Johnson, thoughts about where both of those administrations are going right and wrong. And if you want to kind of take a sort of UK-wide pinpoint, that's where I'd be looking. I think you're on mute, Matt.
I've been muted. This wasn't even my fault. My colleague muted me, Matthew Lesh. He takes any opportunity he can to shut me up, so that's fair enough. In terms of sort of Hartlepool, you think is a really key. That's the additional constituency that's now up for grabs at this election as well. It wasn't in the original plan. That was a seat that was really in contest between the Brexit Party, the Conservative Party, and the Labour Party at the last election. It now looks like a straight fight between Labour and the Tories. This was never a straight fight once upon a time, right? This is not a seat that really Labour should be looking.
No, it wasn't a straight fight, but I think actually, and I think there's going to be a lot of talk about the kind of Brexit legacy for places like Hartlepool, and, you know, I mean, and rightly, because that is the manifesto that Boris Johnson ran on, you know, over a year ago. But we did a kind of, it wasn't Hartlepool specific, but on Times Radio we do a kind of monthly focus group, and we did one with swing voters, and specifically looking at Keir Starmer just sort of earlier this month. And I think the really interesting thing there is that, you know, I think everyone, the kind of general commentariat, it's very easy to jump to a conclusion that because he's not making kind of great big inroads right now, that it's totally lost. And actually the thing that really struck me for Hartlepool, for the Red Wall generally, is that actually when people were sort of given examples of who he was and what he was doing, you know, I think that they'd struggle to pick him out in a lineup, but actually when you get onto the sort of, once you've established who he is and what he's doing, it's a lot less negative actually. And so I think, you know, I think this is going to be a real battle, But I think actually there's a huge potential in the next few years to make up for it. The other thing I thought was very interesting is that people brought up in this focus group that we did anyway, Corbyn gets brought up quite unprompted, and I think that's very interesting, and that happens not just in the Rebel but in other places as well, which shows you that actually there is a legacy there too, which is also interesting.
Is that a positive legacy or a negative legacy? Is there a long shadow of it, or is there a...
Yeah, it tends to be a long shadow. I mean, obviously, you know, the hazard warnings that come with focus groups is that they are not opinion polls. These are kind of often fairly low information people, and these are very much their gut reaction. So I think, you know, I wouldn't dwell too hard on the specifics of it, but it is that it gets brought up, you know, more than once unprompted as a kind of, oh, he's not the other guy and we weren't so keen on him. And I think actually that is something that, you know, Labour can use, and maybe they will use it, but maybe that won't start to happen until after May. I mean, May is actually pretty close now. So
it is. And I think, though, I'm going to bring Christian in for this next bit, because that is one of the major stories of these elections coming up, that the Labour Party, despite a decade of being in opposition to the Conservatives of many, you know, various forms, the coalition, Theresa May's Conservatives, and then Boris's Conservatives. And I would say they are separate Conservative governments rather than a single Conservative government. Without that, the Labour Party doesn't look like it's going to be gaining massive tracts of territory at these elections. Isn't that quite...
Can I jump in super quickly before that? Because I do think actually that these elections really, you have to take them in the context of a pandemic. And I think that there is a huge amount of willingness among people to give a government a benefit of the doubt. And I think it's not, you know, I mean, I think that there are, you know, people are really going to be looking for the delivery of a 2019 manifesto, but I think they, sort of broadly speaking, or certainly from what I've kind of seen, it seems to be that they wouldn't mind that happening, you know, once this whole pandemic is over. And actually right now, I think it's not so much that people rally around it in times of fear, it's that there's just a sort of willingness for things to work, and a willingness for people to kind of, you know, get through the next bit. And that's why actually I think in a sense it would be wrong to draw a lot of kind of sort of 4-year conclusions, because actually I think in a year's time it may well be the case that a lot of people in Hartlepool and other places will be waiting for the delivery of so-called levelling up, to the extent that people have got on board with that message. You know, that is a big thing that people are looking for. It just may not be now. Do
you agree, Calgie? Do you think that they're delivering a 4-year message and not a decades-long message?
Essentially, yes. I mean, the problem for Labour is they've been trying to hit a moving target over the last decade, because it's really been the story of constant reinvention of the Tory party. Obviously,
that's the Tory party all over, isn't it?
Obviously the Tory party's one of the core tenets of its ideology is reform to conserve and stay relevant, and, you know, do what you have to get elected. But in the last 11 years, you obviously had the coalition, the result of which was the Tories made massive gains against the Lib Dems. That was where the anger was taken out. And then you had a Tory majority, and then Theresa May took over, and that was chaotic. But because of the chaos of Theresa May, Boris Johnson is in many people's minds, well, not just Boris as a personality, but the 80-seat majority that he delivered and created this political stability that had been long lacking in the country. A lot of people still, I think, have the memories of how bad it was and how reassuring it can be to have that strong and stable government, to put it that way. I think the other problem for Labour, specifically looking at these former Red Wall areas, and again, talking about Hartlepool, is that there seems to be, in these areas where the Tories were voted in 2019 and for the first time, that already there's a benefit materialising of having MPs from the governing party. The problem with having a Labour MPs in a decade where you've got a Conservative government is it's very difficult to get the government's ear. Whereas what do people in the Tees Valley see after a year and a half of having new Conservative MPs? Well, you've got these big showy things like free ports and the Treasury moving up to Darlington and bits of the department for trade moving into the northeast, and the SSI steelworks regeneration, and all these things. And as someone from the northeast who doesn't go back as much as I like, but goes back for family events and Christmas, pandemic allowing, there's this sense in the air still, and it's being reflected from what I'm hearing on activists at the ground level, that people do not regret that vote. And the high watermark of 2019 has not faded away. In fact, both senior sources I spoke to in the lead up to this webinar in Wales and the Tees Valley basically had the same way of putting it, which was they wouldn't mind an election tomorrow. They don't feel that Boris's popularity has waned. And unfortunately for Labour, it was a pandemic of two halves. It was a pandemic of preventing deaths and general competence of lockdown, which actually the government got a lot of benefit of the doubt for and didn't help Labour in the polls as much as they may have hoped. And then there's the vaccine rollout, which has gone better than anyone could have expected and has delivered a really big bounce. I mean, we're talking consistent 9-10% leads for the government over Labour, and going into a local election after 11 years, that is pretty incredible.
How concentrated are those big percentage differences? You know, I mean, like in the cities are becoming more and more Labour dominated. The suburbs, you're seeing, I think, a little bit of a revanchist position by a new Labour Party that wants to actually win some seats where some young families live, but then out into the countryside, out into anywhere with a level of income above 30,000, and we're looking at Tory entrenchment. And anywhere that has, the Economist had a very good piece about Barratt home developments in the Red Wall seat. As Dino and Mrs. Fiat 500 living within them are pretty solidly Tory now. Our model is broken as to how we think about the country.
They are, but I think one of the absolute key things to remember is, for all the narrative and discussion that's happened throughout 2017 up to now, so much of it is the idea that Labour's former voters are switching because of specific policies or specific personalities. So much of it just has to do with shifting age demographics. And that really accounts for why Teesside is an industrial, high-density area, but is increasingly pro-conservative in a way that obviously Manchester and Leeds aren't, because you don't have these massive student hubs. There's not a big nightlife. In fact, the career and the job flows are still, despite these attempts by figures like Ben Houchen to try and change the economic prospect of the area, there's still a sense that young people have to go to Manchester or Leeds or London or Newcastle to get jobs. And that essentially just leaves a very thick layer of elderly, socially conservative voters behind. And that is really what's shifting this. And that is not going to be an easy thing for any Labour leader to change.
Well, it also creates a strange paradox, doesn't it, for the Conservatives? Because as soon as they make a good area nice and somewhere welcoming that they want to attract young people in, don't vote for them anymore.
I was talking with a former MP last night, and one of the things that exemplifies this really well is the forthcoming debate about boundary reviews. Because it used to be the case that if you were a Tory MP and you were getting the option to sort of sketch out your perfect constituency, then you would just go all the nice housing estates, you'd stick them in yours, and all the council estates you try and offload to the neighbouring Labour MP. Those have all changed, and it's really difficult now for Tory MPs to try and work out which areas are beneficial, because it's such a new realigning of our 50, 100-year-old understanding of class politics and party politics up and down the country, that people are still trying to get a feel on the ground in terms of what constituents are saying.
I sort of wonder about that.
Matt, can I just
go ahead, Poppy.
on a kind of popularity thing, and I think just kind of to add to what Christian was saying is that I think it's worth thinking about the popularity of the party and of the government in sort of two separate strands, because I think you've kind of got to isolate Boris Johnson and to an extent Rishi Sunak as two figures that people can name and even if they don't like, they really are sort of reasonably on board with. And I think that the pair of them will sit very differently kind of coming out of this pandemic than the sort of a kind of government legacy, as in actions made by the kind of nebulous, faceless Westminster lot that people don't particularly like. And I think, you know, there is a feeling, certainly from things that kind of I've seen and heard, that sort of Boris Johnson has been swept along by this. You know, they either think he's a bit buffoony, he's a bit fun, and he's sort of been swept along with this whole pandemic thing. And then Rishi Sunak is just an absolute golden boy that can do no wrong currently. And I think
he's paying the bills, isn't he, Poppy?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Boris was taken ill. This really wasn't like the life that people, what he wanted for his premiership and what people wanted for premiership, and they
actually something that does crop up a lot. Actually, it's sort of this idea that it's not him making the decisions, and I think that's so interesting, because I think that, you know, you could come out of this reasonably intact if a lot of people don't believe that you, the Prime Minister, have necessarily made all the decisions, particularly ones that you might not have necessarily liked that much. And so I think, you know, I think there's it's worth thinking about the personalities as well, when you think about how this is going to kind of play beyond.
And so let's bring in Stephen, because I think that's a great point to doing it in, that those two individuals sit very differently in Scotland than they do elsewhere in the United Kingdom, and that level of allowance for Boris just doesn't exist in the general populace in Scotland. So what's the lay of the land in Scotland? Are we looking to Queen Nicola? Are we looking at a new rebellion, Jacobite rebellion coming down? And what's happening, basically, Stephen?
Well, Matt, I'm going to shock you and say that Boris Johnson isn't hugely popular in Scotland. I know it's hard to believe, but no, it's. In some ways, listening to Poppy and listening to Christian, listening to you, I sort of noticed the parallels, you know, because we have in Scotland a government that has also been in power for an extended period of time. You know, the SNP has been running the devolved administration in Scotland for 14 years now. And for all 14 of those years, Nicola Sturgeon has either been the Deputy First Minister or the First Minister. And yet the opposition can't really seem to get any kind of traction against her. You know, the polling in Scotland just now, I mean, we talk about the Tory leads, I mean, the SNP leads are eye-watering. The most recent panel-based poll on the constituency votes, obviously we have 2 votes for the Scottish Parliament election, but in the constituency vote, the SNP is ahead 24 points of the Tories, and that's one of their more modest leads. So there is I think what we're seeing in this election, we've seen it in previous ones, both Westminster and Holyrood, is that there is a baked-in support for the SNP that is not exclusively, but largely people who support independence. And so the kind of the if you like, the contract between these voters and the SNP is, if you keep voting for the SNP, then you hasten the coming of independence, or at least of another referendum on it. And so essentially you have to, and there is actually a phrase for this that is used among supporters of independence, and it's wheesht for Indy. And it's the idea that you should kind of keep quiet, or you should not emphasize the kind of problems that there are in the SNP's record on health and on education, on the economy, because the kind of the larger cause is independence and is achieving that.
And I mean, they've set out their stall, at least at the beginning of the election, they set out their stall saying that independence was on the ballot. That independence, 2 votes for them, you'd ensure that independence would definitely happen, and that there'd be another referendum. And even if there wasn't a referendum, somebody like hook or by crook, some department would force it. Janet Cherry, obviously, very, very strident going in. That's the tone has shifted, hasn't it, in Scotland? And the SNP are rowing back on some of the it looks like they're trying to shore up what may be quite a soft swing vote. I wonder whether you are detecting something a little bit different than the polls suggest, at least at the moment.
I think it's fair to say that, you know, the Nicola Sturgeon of 2021 is different and speaks differently than the Nicola Sturgeon of, say, 2019 and going into the general election, where again, you know, Indy Rev 2 was the key talking point for the SNP. Nicola Sturgeon today sounds much more like some of the people on her backbenches did a few years ago when they were problematic for her, and she kind of wished that they would wheeshed. Quite frankly, she has had to harden her position for various reasons. Obviously, as part, the fallout from the Salmond inquiry and how that sort of kind of interlinked with the kind of broader SNP civil war about, everything from independent strategy to the Gender Recognition Act. And, Nicola Sturgeon has had to start to talk a lot more and sound a lot more like her voters. It actually sort of reminds me of the sort of Tony Blair going into the 2005 election, where he had to speak a lot more. He didn't swing dramatically to the left, but if you went back and look at his rhetoric, he sounded a bit more like a conventional soft left Labour Prime Minister. And so Nicola Sturgeon's having to do the nationalist equivalent of that, because the issue for her here is, I said that she's on 47% in the most recent poll on the constituency vote, much less so on the regional vote, the second proportional vote that we have, because on that ballot you have the Greens, and the Scottish Greens are essentially a sort of independence first party who also have various sort of ecological concerns. But then there is also a new party, Alba, headed up by Alex Salmond, who you may have heard of.
We'll make sure that we say that right, because otherwise the ire of online nationalists.
Oh, it's like people get very, very angry if you mispronounce any kind of Gaelic term, but especially if you mispronounce Alba. And I'm told it is Alba, so...
There's a little trip, so you say Alba, all right. Okay.
Alba, apparently. I don't speak a word of Gaelic, so if you end up getting cancelled, don't blame me. Alba is interesting. There's some polls suggest that it could break through, some suggest that it's just under the threshold, but the Salmond challenge, the Alba challenge, is essentially that Nicola Sturgeon is gun shy. That Nicola Sturgeon has had, she has been in power, for 6 going on 7 years now. The 2014 referendum, we got 45% of Scots in favour of independence. We've now had Brexit, and Brexit has happened despite 62% of Scots voting against it. Why on earth has there not been a second referendum? And so Alex Salmond's argument is that if you vote for the SNP on your first ballot and vote for Alba on your second, you can create what he calls a supermajority, though he, it's not quite clear exactly how he defines that, and that the sort of the moral force of having multiple parties in the Scottish Parliament who all support a second referendum will somehow bounce Downing Street into granting one.
I suppose the other question therefore is, I've been looking at these elections and thinking, what's the actual trend? Is there a British trend? And the striking one for me is the Labour Party's non-resurgence, and especially though you see that in Scotland. But you also see that in Wales. There's a level to which actually the Labour Party looks a little bit soft in Wales, to the Plaid Cymru pro-independence party, and as well as not gaining big wins in England. The smaller parties usually do relatively well in local elections. Lib Dems have a pretty good ground game, but they don't seem to be making gains either. There's no real sort of Lib Dems fight back surge. Probably. I don't know if you're feeling differently. Maybe in the Lake District there's a bit more of a Tim Farron boom. But the Greens feel a lot more optimistic about winning some seats from the Labour Party, and making hay of maybe sort of climate change being back at issue. And also the fact that the Green Party in Germany looks like it's going to take the lead and be the largest party in the Bundestag. Is this the moment that we see the death of the Labour Party as a national British force, and it starts to become regionalised and parochial, and that we end up with new national parties? Is this the moment?
I don't think on May 6th you're going to wake up, after the vote counting and discover that there's no Labour Party left. I think that would be a stretch. But I do think that it is, I think one thing that's really interesting about the locals, I guess, this is in England, I suppose, rather than the devolved administrations, is that I think the pandemic has kind of put what is devolved to your area much, much more present in people's minds in a way that it hasn't been previously. I think if you were to think, I know this is kind of infringing slightly onto the mayorals rather than kind of councils, but if you remember kind of, the tier system back in the autumn, actually what you saw there was Andy Burnham picking public fights with the government and sort of displaying both what you could have control over and how it would work, and kind of turning it into something that is sort of really recognisable to people. And the same with Liverpool as well. And the idea that sort of Liverpool went along with what the government was saying with the tier system, and they ended up getting surge testing as kind of pat on the head, well done, we'll have a go at testing everybody there. And Manchester not so much. So I think rather than necessarily being kind of boon time for small parties, I think people are aware of what is up for grabs in their community. And again, social care is another huge one that kind of councils and localities are in control of. And people connect with politics based on how they interact with services. Like, I think that's such a fundamental thing to think about, is that really the majority of people who aren't nerds connect with their local politics based on services. And in the past year, you've seen the way that happens, it kind of so fundamentally brought home to you that I think that's where kind of, when maybe the Greens are optimistic or whatever, or smaller parties, I think that's kind of where that comes into play. So I don't think it's necessarily the end of one big currently second party or potentially first party, but it's a kind of a re-examination of how you kind of what you get in your locality and who's running it and why, and knowing about it. And actually, in a way, I think that could be a kind of very positive force for politics and for local politics. I think we've always kind of dismissed devolution and how it works, but actually pandemic is a perfect example of where councils are really best placed to know what's happening and to do things.
I love your term devolution there. I'm pretty sure Stephen Daisley's got some other thoughts.
Okay.
No, I did actually want to come off the back of two things Poppy said that I thought were really interesting. One of which was talking about how the pandemic has brought devolution home, and it's very interesting that in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, although not having really done much that different from the UK government, had in the first part of the pandemic got a lot of credit for, I think essentially kind of her communication skills. And she, unlike Boris, she was kind of quite direct, and there wasn't the kind of foppishness and the sort of the playing up to a character, because Sturgeon is she's a very serious person anyway. The flip side of that, of course, was when the vaccine rollout didn't go as well in Scotland as perhaps it was in England and also Wales and Northern Ireland. That became a problem, and suddenly the virtues of devolution seemed to sort of work differently. The other point I wanted to make, and we're talking about the Greens in Germany and also in the locals in England, is that there is talk in Scotland that if Nicola Sturgeon or if the SNP wins the election, which pretty much everyone expects to happen, absent some massively unforeseen event, that instead of the Scottish Greens essentially, they've not had quite a confidence and supply relationship with the SNP, but they've essentially always been reliable, that they would always vote for the SNP's budgets. There is talk on both sides that there might be some kind of formal coalition, an SNP Green government with Green ministers in that government, and that would be, that's not happened before. We previously had Labour and Lib Dem of coalition governments. We've not had any other kind of coalition, and so for the there is a possibility, depending on how the numbers fall and depending on what Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Green leader Patrick Harvie might decide after May the 6th. There is a possibility we could have Green cabinet ministers in the devolved government in Scotland, and that I think would be that would be a kind of sort of unmistakable sign that that politics is changing to some extent, from a party that even in Scotland with a proportional electoral system, nobody sort of ever really would have thought 5-10 years ago that you could have the Greens in government, even in Holyrood. And I think that would be a sort of a signal moment, and suggest that yes, on the left there are alternatives to the Labour Party for and obviously that applies down south as well.
And Poppy, when you were travelling around with Question Time, the Labour Party in different parts of the country has seen very, very, very distinctly different. Is there like a palpable sense of difference between how the Labour Party is seen in the devolved administrations, in the local areas, And between Scotland and Wales, is there a difference in how Labour places out with the capitals saw the Labour Party? And is there a way back for the Labour Party as like a single unitary national force, or has it sown the seeds of demise?
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that obviously the key difference is that when you go to Wales, you're dealing with the government there, and like you have to remember that you are literally dealing with a different administration that is devolved. So in a sense, it's not that they are seen differently as a party as such, but they are seen as a different force because they are literally doing a different thing. You know, they are running the show. And Scotland, I think, is interesting in a different way in that obviously they, you know, I mean, I haven't been on the programme now for a year, but obviously it hasn't been fantastic the past few years for Scottish Labour. I think it's pretty safe to say. But one thing that so I was going to say about 6 months ago, we did a really interesting Scottish focus group on the kind of, you know, around the anniversary of the referendum. And I think one of the things that stuck for me the most, it's kind of addressing your second point, was that the number of people who said that actually, you know, independence is sort of, to paraphrase, independence is less of an issue, or you'll be more supportive of Westminster if you had a Labour government down south. I mean, it just is a fact that, you know, Scotland matters. It matters both ways. It's not a one-way street. It's not a Scotland only problem. This is actually a problem across, you know, Scotland is as key to Labour doing well in Westminster as it is to the kind of, you know, how it sits within the independence north of the border. So
yeah, I sort of wonder whether that
in one sense they're a small opposition party, in another sense they're a kind of a governmental party. So it's sort of different.
I think like the Labour Party is very interesting in that respect, that it's governing in one part of the country. It's got the mayoralty, but it still feels like effectively a party of protest, Calgie, at the moment. It doesn't seem to know what it is, and I'm not sure that Keith or Keir Starmer, it really sort of epitomises a clear vision for what Labour is in all parts of the country. And in the meantime, of course, he's got rivals with actual power, and who found this year, especially in Mark Drakeford's case, he's found a lot of power. So over whether your shop could be alive, you know, all the things that Boris had and Matt Hancock had, and apart from the money strings and who was going to pay for it, which is everybody else, of course. The Welsh Labour Party had sort of ultimate power, and why on earth would they get back in their box and be told what to do by the Parliamentary Labour Party?
I think the problem for Labour, and this is much broader than just the midterms that we're about to enjoy, is that looking ahead to the next Westminster election, they need a couple of percent to prevent the Tories from getting a majority. But unless they can bring Scotland and Wales and the Red Wall with them on a much larger uniform swing, they are not going to get a majority of their own to govern. And the problem is this, as was expressed to me, for example, returning to Hartlepool. If you're a Hartlepool voter and you're still not persuaded by Boris's Conservative Party, there's a very high chance that you may choose just not to vote, because not only have you got the Keir Starmer factor, yes, he's a slight improvement on Corbyn, there's certainly more trust and there's a greater air of competence. But then you look at what happens with the selection process in Hartlepool, in which you end up with a Labour candidate who basically ran the Labour wing of the second referendum campaign, is pro-Saudi. It transpires yesterday was responsible in 2013 for deciding to move hospital services out of the area when he was on a clinical commission as a GP. And actually what you get still is the sense that Labour are still not putting in the effort to make it seem like they're not taking their former heartlands for granted. I think that's where they differ with Wales, which we haven't really talked about much, because obviously they are in power. They can actually demonstrate what Labour in power will do rather than just talk about it. The interesting thing, I think, for the Welsh election coming up is that you have an incredible spectrum of party opinion when it comes to the status of devolution. You've got everything from Plaid, who is running its most overtly pro-independence campaign, probably for any Senate election, all the way through to the Abolish the Assembly Party, which, if they start scraping 7 or 8%, is going to start cutting into the Tories. The problem is that Mark Drakeford may just fall short of a majority, but because of how Plaid is now running on this really pro-independence ticket, it basically rules them out as a potential coalition partner for the Tories, even if, you know, they were desperate enough just to do anything to get Labour out. So I think because of that, it's much more likely that in worst case scenario, Drakeford's in a coalition with the Lib Dems or something.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to quite an interesting point. That before we move into questions from you guys, which I have seen them coming in, use the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll come to them in a second. Is that when we think of the UK, sometimes we think of the British nation, sometimes we think of the English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish in Northern Ireland, as well as the British Northern Ireland, because 2 communities there. And then on top of that, we have our multicultural society, multi-ethnic society, and hyperlocal identities. But we also sometimes are guilty of monolithic thinking about places like Wales and Scotland. And when we sit there and say, you know, abolish getting 8% and Plaid getting 12 or 15%, and then ending up in coalition and really driving an agenda that is much more nationalistic, much more overtly pro-separation and like division and difference for difference's sake, really starts to reveal in Wales, especially, that those two, firstly, the 2 languages, the communities that exist, but also that rural-urban divide, and also now that you see a bit more of the sort of South Wales, North Wales divide. The North Wales heavily English retirees, lots of people who moved there from Manchester and Liverpool. Lots of people who work across the border. It's a very porous border. Engineering works, international businesses that know the value of the supply chain. But places where you've had to pay a toll road to go across the bridge feel a little bit more cut off, and therefore they don't necessarily feel as the affinity with Bristol and Bath that maybe people in the north do to Liverpool and Manchester. And that's going to be, and so we're feeling the fact that there isn't one Wales, but actually 2 separate ones. It's going to be very interesting, I think. And I don't know about whether that's something that's likely to appear in Scotland as well, Stephen, where you've got maybe, I've already seen the Victoria poster saying about the Northeast Fair deal for the Northeast, or the fair settlement for the Northeast. And also there's those borders issues. And then also the question I wonder about whether the Labour Party is still trying to be too many things to too many people in Scotland, having been the monolithic entity that the crowning party, whether they actually, it's still trying to win Glasgow and it should be focusing on winning Edinburgh. But I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it, Matt. And that Labour used to be the national party of Scotland, the natural party of government in Scotland, and it almost thinks that it can just sort of slide right back in, sort of almost slide back into Scotland's DMs and just say, hi, I'm back, and let's go back to the way things were. And, that it doesn't work like that, I don't think. I think that, the Labour Party does have to focus on where it is strongest, and that is amongst people who are, maybe they don't like Boris, and, they are, they don't like the sort of austerity policies of the Cameron and Osborne years, but they are not convinced by independence. Whereas Labour has not been trying to do that in this campaign. And I think that actually explains where the polls are in the campaign, is that the polling shows that Anas Sarwar, who just took over as leader a couple of months ago, that he is very popular. His satisfaction rating, his net satisfaction rating is, in the most recent poll I saw, was only 3 points behind Nicola Sturgeon, which, if you'd said to me 6 months ago that there would be a Labour leader, or frankly any leader in Scotland who would be within, the margin of error of Nicola Sturgeon, I, wouldn't have believed you. And also, polling shows that Labour is now more trusted on things like the economy, health, education. In fact, in some cases, the level of trust has just sort of doubled, and that is basically an Anas Sarwar factor. What we're not seeing, though, we're seeing a slight uptick in the actual voting intention, but not by enough, for instance, to take the Labour Party back into second place in Scotland. And I think the reason for that is that it is spreading itself too thinly. It is trying to win back its old Central Belt heartlands, which are now as staunchly SNP as they used to be Labour. It used to be, they would weigh the votes for Labour there. Now they weigh the votes for Nicola Sturgeon, but it's also trying to, hold on to sort of leafy, Edinburgh Southern and Dumbarton and places like this, and hoping to maybe win back Eastwood in East Renfrewshire. So it is trying to, go from being the National Party to being all but wiped out, and then it thinks it can kind of spring back again as a National Party, and I don't think it can do that. As to your point about the divisions within the country, I mean, it is interesting that we are talking, we're talking as if Scotland now wants a second referendum, and well, I mean, actually the polling suggests even amongst supporters of independence that it isn't a priority. But also, if you poll the independence question or the referendum question in, for example, the Borders, or in, for example, the Northeast, you will get a very different response than you might get in Glasgow or Dundee. And I think we are starting. I don't think it's as advanced as it is in Wales just now, but I think we are maybe starting to see more of a sense of local or regional identities that are sort of pushing back both against the sort of, the idea of Westminster and also the idea of Holyrood. And that's probably best exemplified in the sort of growing calls for some kind of, if not independence, but autonomy for Shetland. And now sort of the Shetlanders are saying, well, okay, you might want independence for Scotland, but then we want independence from you. And so, in the end, we can all just become our own independent states.
I mean, that's the sort of the interesting thing for me. A lot of what it created a lot of difference. It created a lot of institutional differences that are designed to sort of show up the difference in and of itself, semi-antagonistic alt states that exist within the United Kingdom. And within the auspices, they were designed, of course, within the European Union, so that if you left, you didn't really lose anything because you're just joining the same thing on the trade relationship side. That's obviously changed quite considerably. Whether that's factored in, people's anger from certain quarters towards the results of the Brexit vote has been factored into people's voting intentions, but whether the incentive changes of what independence would mean in Scotland and certainly in Wales, where yesterday Plaid Cymru, I think, said that it wouldn't be possible to know the details of independence before the vote, which was, a really lovely turn of phrase. I mean, honest, at least. They've only had, 100 years to come up with at least some form of prospectus, and 4 years since Brexit to sort of, and a year and a bit since the deal came into force to maybe study the implications of it. But they seem to think that you can sell everything to anyone. Does that work for Scotland? Like, have we got to the point where people now are factoring in the idea of a hard border on the Isle of Great Britain and separate bank accounts and not being able to transact money as easily and so on?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Scottish independence is not the same thing as Brexit, because Brexit is bad and Scottish independence is good. And that is, I mean, I'm being facetious, but it's not far away from the way the SNP presents it. So, SNP politicians have spent the past few years saying Brexit is reckless. Imagine cutting yourself off from from a single market and the country next door that you do all your trade with. Okay, now let's have independence. And that has worked quite well for them. I do think, however, that the sort of the reality of that Brexit, while politically helped the SNP, it helped them in elections, it helped, that undoubtedly the people who voted no in 2014 who have swung towards the independence side of things because of Brexit, and it's sort of become fashionable now almost to say in Scotland that Brexit has made independence more desirable but less politically feasible. That actually, I think there's a growing recognition that if you want independence, either because you don't like Boris or because you think Nicola Sturgeon's better at running things or whatever reason, you now have to contend with these questions, because you can't, spend years saying, oh, these reckless Brexiteers, they're not, they didn't do the homework first, and they didn't care about, what they tore up and the chaos they would cause. And now, but we can do it, and it won't, that kind of thing won't happen because we have good intentions. I think that is starting to fall apart. It's kind of ridiculous that it's taken so long. But there's a growing question now of actually, well, what would it mean? Would we have a hard border at Gretna Green? How do you transport livestock over the Scotland-England border, for example? Things like, even really basic things, getting like veterinarian certificates for when you're transporting animals, and to all the way up to the question of free movement of people. Would we have passport checks? And all of this goes back to the SNP's position itself. Would an independent Scotland be in the EU or not? Now, the SNP's position is nominally that an independent Scotland would be in the EU. I mean, their argument is that actually Scotland would kind of just be grandfathered into the EU, and there wouldn't really be any process. I mean, that you can argue about that, but there are some within the SNP, and a lot of those people have kind of migrated to Alba, who say, well, actually, becoming independent and reclaiming powers from Boris and kind of sopping off at Brussels and handing a load of them to Ursula, and then having to deal with that's maybe not the best approach. Why don't we try something like EFTA? Or the European Economic Area as a sort of halfway house, see how that works, and then build up to the EU membership. So oddly enough,
I mean, that sounds like a lot of detail, Stephen. I wonder whether is it like the devil might be in the detail, but is the voter? Are they looking at
independence and things? I think Stephen makes very good points in that this is what we will be talking about, and that fundamentally will be the reality of it. And I think it's very important to remember that. But actually, I think, well, the thing that I always think when you're thinking about voters and people who engage in local politics and everything else is that people are very smart, even if they don't pay that much attention. So people can really get a feel for a person or an idea kind of very quickly, and are pretty shrewd, even if they're not looking at the detail, which is why it's so important for kind of people to harness a bit of authenticity. I mean, people can just sniff out that kind of stuff much more easily than anybody thinks. So I think the devil is in the detail, like that is fundamental, because that is how the reality will play out. But actually, looking at how people engage with stuff, the surface level is equally important. It has to be.
Can I make one quick point on Scotland, which is that actually not just Scotland, but the whole of the elections that are coming up. And the one aspect we haven't touched on yet is going to be turnout and engagement.
That was the very first question.
A whole massive area.
Eamon Butler, who asks the first question, he always gets the first question as founder of the ASI. Do you predict the usual miserably low turnout in this year's elections? And does that matter? Christian,
well, it will certainly matter in Scotland, and I'll tell you why. When I was talking to a Conservative Scottish MP ahead of this webinar, they obviously are under no illusion that they are going to be forming the next Scottish government. But attention is turning to how can they legitimately deny a second Scottish referendum. And if you look at turnout in previous Scottish parliamentary elections, they've hovered just above the 50% mark. In 2016, it was 55%. There's a fingers crossed aspect to this, which is that if turnout falls below 50%, Nicola Sturgeon will not have the legitimate mandate to try and get another referendum, because even if she got 50% of the total vote, it would only be about 25% of Scottish votes overall. So I think that's very interesting, a perspective to see how the Tories are going to try and prevent this second referendum, even though they're not going to be in a position to take the leadership. And again, going back to issues like by-elections and stuff, a lot of it is going to be won and lost on people not turning out. And to what extent can the attackers, the advancers, rally a core vote and hope that the establishment, whether it's Labour in Wales, whether it's Sadiq Khan in London, and that is, I think, the first London reference we've made in the last 45 minutes, which says a lot, whether it's Labour in Hartlepool, can their voters care as little enough about the election, not really care about Paul Williams or Mark Drakeford, and just sit at home and let the Tories or Plaid advance a bit better than they otherwise might have done? And COVID is going to play into that, because I think there will be anxieties about voting.
Christian, before we move on, do you think that the Tory party can ever really be forgiven for giving up on London, the country's capital city, in many ways the world's capital city, sort of thrown away to a candidate that they didn't think was going to win, that they did not really think had a chance against an incumbent, and who was running the same campaign, or came into it running the same campaign as the guy who just lost in spectacular fashion?
I think they can be forgiven on this occasion, provided it's not a permanent tactic going forward.
Guido Fawkes forgiving the Tory party. This has never happened before.
Well, I say that from the perspective of the Conservative Party MPs, activists, or whatever, because it just doesn't make sense, right? You've got this insane Labour vote on steroids in London because of not just Brexit as an issue, but the cultural barriers that has really put in the minds of both people inside and outside of London. You know, within England, we talk about regional identity, we talk about national identity. The them and us aspect between the rest of England and London cannot be understated. Okay, Sean Bailey is worse than they could have possibly imagined. He could have done a little bit better, but is it tactically better for the Tories to give up on London and focus on Andy Street and Ben Houchen? Of course it is, because what's an extra 5% chipped off Sadiq Khan, whether he runs on the first round or immediately on the second round? It makes sense tactically, but I hope they put in a bit more effort, if only from my perspective of not really having much to report on when it comes to London politics at the moment.
I mean, yes, Lawrence Fox aside, and probably will by that the better. But Stephen Daisley, the sort of the emergence of the Greens is a sort of a phenomenon. The fact that they needed a list party to sort of get over the line for, to have transfer votes, and Alaba wanted to replace the Green Party effectively. They wanted to be Sturgeon's cronies rather than Salmon's cronies, maybe in some of the parlance of the current election. Are there any seismic sort of do we expect that these are the parties that will end up, if there is a referendum in one, or that this is going to be the lay of the land for the next 5 years, or is Scotland's fundamental party politics shifting totally as well? Are we going to end up with an ultra nationalist party just because if the nationalists aren't flag waving enough? And what does that entail? How does that help or hinder the relationships with the rest of the United Kingdom? And does it endear us to as British people to the Scottish as people and our fellow Britons in Scotland?
Well, I think that it's always important to remember the context in which this is happening. If this were an election in which there hadn't been a referendum in 2014 and sort of independence wasn't the issue, I don't think the SNP might still be in the lead. I don't think you would be seeing, however, 3 independence parties quite possibly getting seats at Holyrood. It is. I mean, I think Alba is on the threshold. It might break through, it might not. But if it does get MSPs, it's not going to get a huge number of them. I think the question as to whether Alaba or something like Alaba, endures or something else like it comes along it's down to Nicola Sturgeon. So let's imagine for a minute that either the SNP or the SNP plus the Greens and maybe plus Alaba, gets a majority on May 6th. Nicola Sturgeon sends a letter to Boris and says we like a Section 30 order to hold a referendum, and Boris says, as he is expected to say, no, we're coming out of a pandemic, we've got the recovery, build back better, etc., etc. The question then, the focus then becomes on Nicola Sturgeon. What does she do? Because, she has a lot of not just, grassroots activists and backbenchers at Holyrood who are very agitated. She now has, alternative parties, be they very small, or in the case of Alba, just now very, very small, but the party's biting at her ankles, and she also needs to think about that, not just for this election, but for future elections. If she is seen as sort of taking no for an answer from Boris, on a Section 30 order, do you start to see something like Alba, expanding, becoming more of a threat to the SNP? And so a lot of it will come down to what Nicola Sturgeon does. The flip side of that, of course, will also come down to what Boris Johnson does. And the Prime Minister has played his cards close to his chest about how his feelings about this. That every now and then he comes up to Scotland, although he's not going to be coming up for the rest of the campaign, which I think Douglas Ross was quite happy about, probably. But every now and then he comes up and says,
"Is Rishi going up?"
I don't know. I think he might have been up already a while back.
Rishi has a different response in Scotland as well.
Thing is, yes, that's funny, because I think Poppy was saying earlier on, people in Scotland like Rishi Sunak.
He's paying the bills. We all know that.
He's the person putting the money in your bank account, and so it's like it's like in Scotland, it's like, oh, we don't want those bloody Tories coming up from Westminster. Oh, apart from Rishi, he's nice. We like him because he isn't, he's sending up checks. But no, I think a lot of it will come down to how Downing Street reacts. There's the kind of the Michael Gove wing, which is, wants to sort of love bomb and sort of spend lots more money. But then I think there are also those who are realizing that there might have to be a bit of a more kind of Canadian style approach, the way that Jean Chrétien's government dealt with the Quebec nationalists in the mid-90s. So yeah, you could end up with a Scottish Parliament that does have a supermajority, however you define that term, of nationalists. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're heading for a second referendum. And absent some kind of Supreme Court challenge, I think that there's a general agreement that this matter is reserved to the UK Parliament, and and there's no kind of polite way to say it, but if Westminster says no, then there isn't a huge amount that
we know, but we both know, Stephen, that when Westminster can say no, but Westminster has to legislate to say no.
You don't have to convince me of that.
Ambiguity. Joanna Cherry has very ably explained the ambiguity that exists, and because the Court of Session has been elevated to a point where it is almost equivalent to the Supreme Court on certain issues, before it goes to the Supreme Court for final judgment on constitutional, whether it has the remit to do that or not, it's given this power. It's been given this power by a piece of, well, I would describe it as a piece of constitutional vandalism, but that's a different story for another day. and Poppy's eyes would roll. She's heard me.
Poppy's like the sensible person here.
Oh, she is. She's like, so Poppy is the most sensible person in the room, I think, in the virtual room. In terms of, yeah, I think, because there's that ambiguity, the Westminster now has to actively remove their ability to do that. That becomes very easy to push as a narrative for the SNP to the next election, and much harder for the Conservatives to fight against in Scotland. Therefore.
Well, I mean, I've been banging on for a couple of years now about the argument for having what I call a new act of union, or some kind of legislative response that sort of makes devolution work for the union, and not just work for the SNP, as it seems to have been doing for the past 14 years. And I would note, this is not a shameless plug, but Adam Tompkins, who is just standing down at this election, he was a Conservative MSP and also a law professor at Glasgow University, has a piece up on the Spectator Coffee House website this afternoon, saying he now supports an act of union, and sort of suggesting ways that the UK government could legislate so that devolution, which was never intended to be a stepping stone to independence, and that Westminster can prevent it being used in that way. But the point you make, yes, that that would become, you know, let's say it would become a recruiting sergeant for the SNP. The flip side of that, of course, is that everything else has been a recruiting sergeant for the SNP. Brexit has been, and quite frankly, if Brexit hadn't happened, you know, the SNP would still have done well. It's sort of, you know, the fact is that the SNP essentially has between 40 and 45% of the vote baked in, you know, because of independence, because it holds out the promise that independence is round the corner. Those big bad Tories are keeping it from you, but if you stick with us, you know, the kind of the new dawn is just over the horizon. And as long as that, you know, that narrative remains in place and is not challenged by Westminster, and I think you only can challenge it legislatively, then you're never going to get back to this. And I hate to, it's a very normie thing to say, but like normal politics. So you're never going to get back to the point where, you know, Labour could possibly start to make gains again in Scotland. And frankly, if Labour doesn't make gains in Scotland, it becomes very, very difficult for them, if not impossible for them, to get a majority at a UK general election.
Well, I wonder, of course, about whether I'm just shocked at the fact that the lack of shock and awe campaign that the Labour Party could do in Scotland, highlighting the level of deprivation within places like Nicola Sturgeon's own constituency, the drug deaths that the Tories managed to bring up, despite the fact that the Home Office has control over drug policy to the Westminster level. These are open goals for the Labour Party that sit well. Health as well, you know, making sure that having people, more patients left from hospital without COVID tests in Scotland, and there are higher deaths in care homes. Much easier for the Labour Party to try and win these, and they just don't seem to have the appetite, right? But I do wonder, as we are very strict on time, and we've already gone 2 over. It's a really sunny day. You were talking about sunlit uplands and sunrises, but actually it's sunsetting here in London. I hope you're managing to go out and enjoy the pub. Stephen, you've still got a few weeks to go before you're allowed out from jail from Nicola Sturgeon. But in the meantime, I hope the elections go well for you all. And yes, make sure you guys at home vote as well. It's your democracy. You use it. Thank you very much, guys, and see you next time at the Adam Smith Institute.